I am pleased to be joined by a friend and a colleague of the show. NBC Sports insider Ben Cross is joining me. Ben, good morning. I appreciate you joining me. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Jonah? Great to be here.
I'm doing well. First of all, did you even hear about uh, the European Super League? I know you're not a big soccer fan, but I know that NBC does cover a lot of soccer, so I have to imagine that that was discussed with you guys a little bit.
Well, obviously, we weren't necessarily aware how the broadcasting rights would shift if that league were to happen. We are the exclusive provider of the Premier League, at least in the U.S., and the U.S. market was one of the big drivers of the Super League. But we ultimately weren't told all that much. We were very aware of what was going on. And I think it was pretty clear almost immediately after the initial news that almost no club outside of the teams that decided to break off were going to be in support of this. The UEFA came out and said that any team that joins this is banned, any player is banned. Obviously, FIFA said the same. That would obviously affect the World Cup. It was shattering news as soon as it came out, and obviously what we saw unfold yesterday, it probably won't happen. There's still a chance, but I think most likely, at least with a lot of the teams from the Big Six and the PL leaving Juventus and a few other teams, it doesn't seem very likely. So it was shocking news. We definitely followed it over at NBC Sports and Peacock, but it wasn't something that ultimately we were too worried about, only because it was still in its novelty and in its early stages and never really formed to be what would have scared the entire world of soccer or football.
So let's shift to the NFL because I have to tell. I know that we're both excited about this NFL draft. I have to be honest with you, Ben. This is probably the first year since I can remember that there is so much intrigue within the top 10 picks just surrounding the quarterbacks. I mean, the the way that people's opinions have fluctuated over the past couple of days, couple of weeks, it's almost amazing to me. And again, I don't want to ask you so much just yet about which teams should draft which quarterbacks, but what do you think about just all this movement around surrounding the opinions of these different quarterbacks? I mean, one week you have, oh, Mac Jones is going to be the third overall quarterback taken. Then Justin Fields' stock rises. Now we have Trey Lance entering the fold a little bit. What do you make of all this uncertainty and all of these fluctuations when we're trying to evaluate these quarterbacks?
Well, it's still early. We still have a week or so to go before the draft. And I think when it comes down to quarterbacks, when a lot of teams start to experiment with, oh, are we going to move up in the draft? There are rumors that certain teams become involved with the conversation. That's when these quarterback stocks go up and down. There's nothing these quarterbacks can do outside their pro days, which obviously are pretty isolated incidents and aren't high competition. They're just throwing to their own receivers in their own facilities. It's very controlled. It's not very experimental. It's really just them showcasing the fact that they can throw a football without pads on. There's not really too much to it. The only evaluation that can really change is what quarterback situations are out there for them. If there's a team like the 49ers that seems intent on drafting a quarterback, then which quarterback would they be most likely to take? Obviously, the rumors around them have been they're leaning toward Mac Jones. That rumor has come out or has been out in the stratosphere for a little while now, so I wouldn't be necessarily shocked if they've changed their tune. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the quarterback situations that these teams are involved in. And as these teams are rumored to move up and down in the draft order, I think that's when certain quarterbacks start to move up or down as far as their stock is concerned, because they're not the quarterbacks themselves can't do anything right now outside of manage their own PR to the point where they could either move up or down the draft. So I think it's the usual process. Obviously, there's a deeper draft from big names, big quarterbacks that might go. I don't necessarily see it as one of the deeper drafts as far as quarterback talent, only because I genuinely believe there's only two, maybe three guys that I could see as consistent starters in the NFL. I think everyone else, at least right now, appears to be career backups that just have a big name, will go in the first round because of what the quarterback market is. But ultimately, I don't see all that many quarterbacks in this draft that are going to have lasting impact in the NFL.
So let's stick with one of the specific teams because I think that the San Francisco 49ers are in such a precarious situation. It's interesting, Ben, because you would think that when you trade up for a number 3 pick and you give away so much to get that pick, you would think that the GM and the coach are aligned and they have the same process and the same mindset about a specific player. Clearly, that's not the case. Shanahan, at least has been reportedly interested in Mac Jones. John Lynch, the GM, interested in Justin Fields. Now, I've always said, and I know that the Jets are enamored with Zach Wilson, so I know they're going to take him. I've always said since the beginning of the season that I thought Justin Fields is the second best quarterback in college football. Obviously, he's not going to go to the Jets. Okay. But how surprised are you that those two aren't on the same page? And ultimately, who do you think the 49ers will go with? Do you think it'll be Justin Fields, or do you think Kyle Shanahan, if the reports are true and he likes Mac Jones, they might head with the Alabama quarterback?
I think it's interesting with that rumor that Shanahan has been interested in Mac Jones for a while now, and he's paid such close attention to him. I think they might be shifting direction at a certain point here, and I think it might go Lynch's way eventually toward Justin Fields. I think if you look at the pro days and what we've seen out of both quarterbacks since college football has ended, Justin Fields has seemed like the more impressive talent and has a higher ceiling. I don't think either of them are going to be consistent starters in the NFL, to be honest with you. I think they'll get their shot. But I think if you saw Mac Jones, even his pro day, he was missing wide open passes. He was not really showing all that much range as far as how far he can throw a football. This is without pads. And this is not something we should be shocked to see out of Alabama quarterback, considering how much receiver talent they have and have had. Obviously, we saw Tua in his first few seasons in college football seemed to be one of the most impressive talents we've ever seen at that level. And then he shows up with all the talent in the world in the Dolphins and really didn't have all that much of an impressive season. Granted, it was his rookie year and he was coming off of an injury outside of college, but it still was a situation for him to succeed in, and he didn't do all that well. I think Justin Fields has a higher ceiling, but ultimately I think they will go for Fields. Mac Jones just doesn't seem to be all that polished. He had a little bit of time in college football with some of the best receivers in college football who are about to be first-round picks. It just seems to me like Justin Fields is a higher upside, and especially if you're going to have someone compete with Jimmy Garoppolo, you want to train them for the future. And I just don't think Mac Jones has as much athleticism as Justin Fields, and I think that's going to hurt him in the long run. I think he has to be ready-made for the NFL now, and I don't believe that he is. And the more time that this rumor spends out in the NFL stratosphere, the conversations going on, I think the more people are going to realize, that might have been a strategy, that might have been a ploy just to put that out there, and then they go for Justin Fields when the draft actually happens.
So the pick that to me I'm most anticipating is the next one, is the Atlanta Falcons. The 49ers is intriguing because you know it's going to be a quarterback, but the Falcons are the first pick where you don't know what direction they're truly going to go in. Are they going to opt to try and draft, kind of pull a Green Bay and draft a backup quarterback who would eventually replace Matt Ryan, or will they try and expedite the rebuild, or will they try and actually fill a position that they need to be filled? Probably on the defensive end, they need a pass rusher. They need so much on the defensive side. If you were the GM, Terry Fontenot, would you kind of go in the direction of a Green Bay and draft a backup that you think would eventually replace Matt Ryan, or do you think they should draft a position they actually need filled on the defensive side of the ball?
It's difficult. Normally, I would say, without a question, go to the defensive side of the ball. There's not all that many great defenders out there this year. They could go cornerback. They could go Patrick Surtain out of Alabama. That would be a little bit of a reach. I think he might fall a little bit toward the latter end of the top 10. Quarterback's a big investment, though. So you've got two ends of this that really aren't all that positive. It's not a great draft for what the Falcons would need. I think they'll ultimately go backup quarterback, regardless of what Matt Ryan says. He says he wants to play in his 40s. He has shown some weakness at times. He's a little unstable. Sometimes he'll throw 6 touchdowns in a game, and sometimes he'll throw 6 interceptions in a game. You really don't know what you're going to get out of Matt Ryan at this point. He is a proven talent as far as he will not lose you games for the most part, and he could get you with a very successful team, as we've seen with him, to the Super Bowl. The question is whether they want to invest in something more long-term. But I think, at least with the Falcons' history, they're not going to bet on a guy unless they know he eventually will be an NFL talent and they can actually train that and make sure that he is. I don't know if they necessarily view any of the quarterbacks in this draft as NFL ready talents or guys who will eventually be at that point. So I think there's a big internal discussion going on with the Falcons right now, and I think they're ultimately going to have to look inward and say, do we actually believe in any of these guys, or should we just throw a pick that might be a little bit of a reach on the defensive front? Because there's really not all that many pass rushers. There's almost no defensive linemen. There's some decent guys in the secondary you could grab in this draft. But as far as top 10 talents are concerned, you almost might be better off taking a chance on one of these quarterbacks, knowing you have Matt Ryan, because there's not all that much else that you could fill for a need right now, unless you trade out of that pick, grab some future picks, and then ultimately spend that on some defensive talent later in the draft.
So I want to stick to a team that's close to home for you, your Dallas Cowboys. I know as a fan, Ben, you're screaming defense. I mean, Patrick Surtain seems like a surefire bet at number 10. You would draft him. However, I want to throw out a situation. If Kyle Pitts somehow, and I don't think he's going to fall that far, if he falls to number 10, you are the Dallas Cowboys. What would you do?
Depends about what Dallas Cowboys you're talking about. If you're talking about Jerry Jones at the helm and him ultimately having the final executive decision, he would go for Pitts. But in recent years, I'd say the last 6 or 7 years, the Cowboys have shifted more towards Stephen Jones' discretion in these type of decisions. We saw that with Johnny Manziel when he was on the board. The Cowboys passed on him. I think it was when Paxton Lynch was on the board. They passed on him and ultimately ended up with Dak Prescott. Stephen Jones seems like he has the market right now. I don't think that's going to be a conversation they're ultimately going to have because Pitts will go earlier, and I think his price will be too high for them to draft up to get him, which from a Cowboys fan perspective would be an absolute nightmare. I think Surtain is ready-made for the Cowboys. He's exactly what they need. He is a dominant player. I think he's absolutely going to be NFL ready, if not this year, the following season. Pitts, he's a generational tight end, but what are you looking for from the Cowboys offense at this point? You're really just looking for a healthy Dak and for Zeke not to get injured or just sell out. And beyond that, you really don't need any other weapons. The Cowboys have solid tight end room. They don't need another one. They certainly don't need to reach for one. And Kyle Pitts would exactly be that. So I hope the Stephen Jones side of the Cowboys will emerge in this draft and ultimately let Kyle Pitts go where he's going to go and then fill to the need, which is what the Cowboys have done in recent drafts. And they've had relatively successful drafts. Last year was a very successful draft. You can argue CeeDee Lamb was a bit of a reach, but at the same time, from where he fell, they ultimately got a good snag. You would hope that type of philosophy is out the window at this point. If Kyle Pitts falls to them, I think they'll ultimately take them. I don't agree with the decision, but I think that ultimately would be what would happen. But he's not going to fall to 10. That would be quite a shocker.
I kind of right now in a mock draft scenario have the Miami Dolphins perhaps at number 6, taking him more likely to truly evaluate Tua. But we'll see what that happens. I've even heard some reports about hypothetically, if a guy like Trey Lance dropped all the way to 10, would Jerry Jones consider it? I don't want to entertain it too much. I know you can get into a whole argument about it, so we'll leave it for the hypothetical. But let's transition to the NBA, Ben. This MVP race is really interesting to me because I almost feel like, not unfortunately, but I think that it's possible that one of the MVPs this year, it may come about more out of default versus whether or not they are truly the best player. I think that Joel Embiid, when he's been playing this year, I know he's missed games, and I love Nikola Jokic, but to me, when Joel Embiid has been playing, he's been the most dominant player in basketball. So I have a slight edge for him, but it's a very controversial pick. If you had to bet on the NBA MVP right now, who would you give it to?
It's a very tough bet to make because, as you mentioned, I think there could be two philosophies with the MVP this year. It could ultimately be who's the best player or who has just put up the best numbers this season. And as we've seen, a lot of the best players are sitting. A lot of the best players are injured. It's very tough to assess. I mean, Steph Curry, if he had been healthy this whole season and been playing at this pace, which obviously is a lot to ask, would be the clear front runner, but he has only shown in recent weeks coming back from that injury, the stats that he would need to put that up. Obviously, you mentioned Jokic. I mean, there's a number of guys. Giannis is always in that conversation. And, you can talk about just a number of guys. Embiid is obviously, I think, the big name right now. If I had to bet on it, I would say Jokic. But Embiid, that's a lot is dependent on whether he can stay healthy. We know his injury past. If he can stay healthy and continue at this pace, I think it'll ultimately be Embiid. But if Steph Curry continues at this pace, it would be tough to see him losing out to anyone. I mean, guys making 10 threes a game, I think that's pretty historic at a certain point. So we'll certainly see. I think it's ultimately going to depend which player stays healthy the longest and plays the most this season, because ultimately I think they'll outlast everyone else in the conversation and just put up the best stats. And I think that's ultimately where the NBA will go, given all the injuries, Anthony Davis, LeBron, everyone being out. It's tough to see how the NBA would just say, oh, well, we know in other seasons they've played better, so we'll just give it to them based on a, small sample size. I think if you had to bet Jokic only because of remaining healthy throughout the rest of the season, and they do have to stay on, I think, a title contending team, which Jokic you could argue is, Embiid you could argue is, Steph probably not. So I think that's another a discussion that will have to enter the conversation.
Man, wouldn't that be fun if Steph won again? It would be. I think for him to seriously merit some strong consideration, I think the Warriors would have to avoid the play-in tournament. I think they'd have to be at least a top 6 seed at the minimum. Which
it's possible.
Listen, it's anything's possible, but man, he's been on this just torrid streak. It's been super fun to watch him. That would be amazing if he ended up winning the MVP, or at least if it really came down to like the last couple of games for the voters. Final question before I let you go. I don't think I actually asked you about this because we didn't really get a chance to recap the NCAA championship. Were you surprised at all by Baylor kind of just steamrolling Gonzaga? Was that at all a shock to you?
No, it wasn't a shock to me. It was a shock to me that Gonzaga was so heavily favored in the Vegas line. I think they ultimately at tip were favored by 4.5, but in the week prior, I think it was, or at least in the days prior, considering when the Final Four happened, I think they were favored by 6.5 right after they ultimately beat UCLA, Gonzaga, that is. But Baylor is just such a dominant team. I mean, from the tip of the tournament, they didn't leave any questions. I don't think they were ever in a close game. And when you saw how they handled Houston, who was a very solid team. I mean, I get that Houston wasn't one of the perennial powers throughout the season, but they dominated them. And I think we like to view college basketball now as this offensive juggernaut. If you put up 90 points a game like Gonzaga, you're going to be an elite team. Baylor was the best defensive team in the field, and they proved that each and every night. I mean, Mitchell, I couldn't believe how good of a defender he was. I mean, as Wisconsin fans, we saw Baylor against
do you take any solace in knowing that on that topic that Wisconsin did go out early in the second round, but the team that they lost to steamrolled everyone and won the whole thing?
You could argue Wisconsin put up as good of an effort against Baylor.
They did. I think they did.
So, right. For us, it's not necessarily a shock that Baylor just continued on that stretch. I mean, you saw Trice was on an absolute tear going into that game. He was absolutely shut down. The guards were amazing. And then if you look at the actual individual matchup between Gonzaga and Baylor, Drew Timme was really what was driving Gonzaga. I know everyone likes to say Jalen Suggs. He really only showed up in overtime and in the latter half of the game against UCLA. It was Timme's team, and he was absolutely shut down against Baylor. The big men for Baylor came in and just absolutely demolished him, gave him no open opportunities. He was missing shots left and right. Baylor was just an all-around elite team. They could score the ball whenever they wanted to. They had great shooters. They didn't have great front court play as far as centers were concerned, but they didn't need it. Their shooters were so good. They were great in transition, and their defense was so suffocating. They really gave no team a chance. And as good as Gonzaga was, they were an offensive team. And if you slowed them down and forced them into some uncomfortable shots, I think you saw some weakness throughout the year. And this is always the thing with Gonzaga. They had a relatively easy road to the Final Four and ultimately the championship game. Obviously, UCLA pushed them to their very limits. They hadn't really had to play a competitive game since very early in the year, and they dominated all those games. They didn't know how to react to adversity. They kept it closer in the second half than I think I would have expected at halftime. But regardless, Baylor was the undisputed national champion, and I wasn't surprised at all.
Always good stuff from Ben Cross. You can follow him on social media. Check out Peacock and all the other content that NBC Sports is putting out. Ben, thanks for coming on the show, man. Always great catching up with you.
Thanks for having me, Jonah.
All right, Ben Cross.